London Calling. David Hirsh, hello, is a lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and co-founder of Engage, a campaign that he founded against the academic boycott of Israeli academics. According to his Wikipedia page, for several years he was a member of the Trotskyist Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and during the 1980s, a leading activist in the National Organization of Labor Students. These go to his credentials to speak about left anti-Semitism. And he received the Phillips Abrams Prize for the best first book in sociology from the British Sociological Association for his book, Law Against Genocide, Cosmopolitan Trials. Daniel Steinkoken, joining us from Arizona, is a scholar of Jewish and Israeli studies who has previously taught at UCLA and the University of Greifswald in Germany. He has published on Jewish-Christian relations and Israeli film, among other topics, and is the creator and producer of the academic performance, Breach of Protocols, Revisiting Zion's Elders, which you may be able to see at a theater near you at some point in the future. We'll hear more about that. It interrogates and subverts the notion of anti-Semitic forgery, namely the protocols of Zion, Elders of Zion. And so with that, I turn it to David Hirsh to introduce himself and his argument for about 5 minutes, not more, and then we'll turn it over to Daniel Steinkoken for the discussant. David, we can't hear you.
Sorry, is that better?
Sorry.
Is that better? Sorry, we should be used to this by now. Is that good now, yes?
Yep.
All right, big apologies. Firstly, so I want to say two things. I want to say something about the history of left anti-Semitism, within which our left anti-Semitism is a part. And secondly, I want to say something about our method, the method of how we study anti-Semitism. So firstly, there is an authentically left-wing anti-Semitism. It's an anti-Semitism about finding explanations for why the world is so terrible and oppressive, and understanding it, making it better. And this goes back, you know, to the people that Marx interacted with, Bauer, Bakunin, Dühring. It goes back to August Bebel talking about the socialism of fools. It goes back to Stalinism and the purges of Jews in the Soviet Union and the purges of Zionists in East Germany in 1968 and in Poland in 68 and in Czechoslovakia in 51. And it also runs through other parts of the Western left in 68, where the Western left tried to kind of emancipate itself from Stalinism and managed to emancipate itself from most parts of it, but the anti-Semitism was still there. So there is an authentic left-wing anti-Semitism that we need to deal with, that is part of our history, that we need to teach our people, our students, our young activists of and about, and that they are joining this movement, which has this long temptation to conspiracy fantasy, firstly. Secondly, I want to say this. We start, in my view, by looking at the world, right? And I want to start by looking at anti-Semitism. I don't want to start by looking at things that are not anti-Semitism. I don't want to start by looking at criticism of Israel or people inventing anti-Semitism or all kinds of other interesting things. I want to start by looking at the anti-Semitism which we see around us, which we observe, which we document, and which we feel. Because if you exist and operate within an anti-Semitic scholarly milieu or an anti-Semitic labor movement, you feel it. It hurts because it pushes you out and it alienates you and it makes you homeless politically. So I want to start with just a few examples of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Please stop me when I have run out of time. And I know that Daniel is going to go on and talk about some of the conceptual frameworks around how we understand this phenomenon, but I want to start with the phenomenon. We start with the phenomenon, and then we go on to look at how we understand it. July the 3rd, 2012, the South African Sociological Association had a conference. A professor walked in, Peter Alexander, and he said, "Who is the Israeli fellow?" And he picked out the Israeli fellow who was ready to give a paper on a panel about social protest movement in Israel, on a panel with other people. He said, "Who is the Israeli fellow?" And the Israeli fellow made himself known. And the big professor said, "Would you please take this moment to denounce Israeli apartheid?" And the Israeli said, "No, this is not a discussion about Israeli apartheid. This is a discussion about something else. And I will not denounce it in the terms that you require me to denounce it in." And the professor led a walkout. He said, "We're not going to boycott you, but we're going to go and have our panel somewhere else." And they left the Israeli fellow sitting on his own, talking to himself, right? An example of anti-Semitism. Let me go on while we're in South Africa. Bongani Masuku is a very interesting guy. He's the international officer of COSATU, of the Confederation of South African Trade Union Federation. He's a powerful guy. He's interesting because he was found guilty of anti-Semitic hate speech by the South African Human Rights Commission back in, I think, 2010. It went to court. The man was still invited to international platforms to make an argument for a boycott of Israel. This is what Bongani Masuku said on campus, 2009. "The following things are going to apply. Any South African family," I want to repeat so that it is clear for anyone, "any South African family who sends its son or daughter to be part of the Israeli Defense Force must not blame us when something happens to them with immediate effect." I could go on and talk much more about Bongani Masuku and his welcoming in the British trade union movement, but let me move on to, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, who was not marginal to the British Labour movement, but was the very leader of the Labour Party. And it's well known that he referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends. He said, "It will be my pleasure and honour to host an event in Parliament where our friends from Hezbollah will be speaking. I'd also invited friends from Hamas." And he was kind of put on the spot about this, and he said, "Well, I was for peace. I was for a peace process. I was for dialogue, and these guys were in the room, and I was using the term friends in a kind of diplomatic way." And he kind of wormed his way out of the question in that way. Are they your friends? But further on in the same speech, and it's documented on video on YouTube, he referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as organizations that were dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people, bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. He articulated his political support for those organizations. Jeremy Corbyn, for example, he habitually defended anti-Semites when Jews rose up and said, "This is problematic." Ra'ad Salah, for example, was a Palestinian leader in Israel, and there were many quotes of Ra'ad Salah being anti-Semitic. Quote, "We have never allowed ourselves to knead the dough for the bread that breaks the fast in the holy month of Ramadan with children's blood. Whoever wants a more thorough explanation, let him ask what used to happen to some children in Europe whose blood was mixed in with the dough of the holy bread." Jeremy Corbyn invited Salah to the House of Commons, and the quote amongst many is, "Salah is far from a dangerous man." So this medieval blood libel was redescribed as criticism of Israel. I could go on, I'll give you one or two more examples. and then I'll stop because I'm sure my 5 minutes is up. But I think it's important methodologically to begin with the anti-Semitism. Jeremy Corbyn was a presenter on the English language propaganda channel of the Iranian state television, Press TV. He was paid quite a lot of money for it, and he participated in the making of anti-Semitic films and TV on behalf of the regime that ran Iran. People might remember the Mir One mural that Jeremy Corbyn said was criticism of capitalism, which had the conspiracy theory and the big Jewish noses and the rich Jews making money off the backs of the poor. People might remember that. Let me finish for the moment with this. This is a quote from 95 leading student Jewish activists that was in the press this weekend. Quote, when Jewish students who protested against Jeremy Corbyn's visit to the University of Bristol described being called a filthy Zio and a puppet of the Zionist lobby, and being repeatedly asked who was paying them to be there, and told that they should go back to where they belong, they were not encouraging criticism of the state of Israel. Rather, they were experiencing naked anti-Semitism. And let me give you one more for a particular reason. A number of MPs, Labour MPs, some of them were Jewish and some of them were Labour MPs who opposed anti-Semitism, were women. And the Jewish women and the women who opposed anti-Semitism were particularly subjected to abuse and to all kinds of threats of violence. Many of them were misogynistic threats of sexual violence. I have a quote here in front of me that was sent to Margaret Hodge and to Ruth Smeeth. I don't even want to read it because it's actually kind of violently misogynist. But it's true that the Labour women, when Labour was an anti-Semitic party, were specifically and more subjected to anti-Semitism from the cadres of people that were brought into the party by Jeremy Corbyn, that were around the party supporting Jeremy Corbyn, that thought of themselves as being his guys. I could go on literally all day and night, giving you hundreds of examples of what it is that we're talking about. But I'll leave that there for the moment, and hopefully I will come back and me and Daniel will have a discussion about the ways in which I've made sense of some of this.
Thank you, David. Okay, now we turn it over to Daniel Steinkoken.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much to David and Lenka for the kind invitation to participate in this workshop, and thank you also to David Hirsh. David, it's been very enjoyable and stimulating for me to, so to speak, spend the last few days with you, reading your book and your recent paper. And I just want to make clear that what I'm responding to, I'm going to change my remarks in keeping with what we just heard, but I've been working the last few days on going through David's 2017 book, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, and then a more recent paper, a position paper really, that he wrote, which is a critique of the call to reject the IHRA declaration or definition of anti-Semitism. So let me just step back a little bit and explain what I mean by that. So there's the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which some years ago, David knows all this material better than I do, developed about 2005, I believe, actually, put forward a definition or a set of rubrics for helping determine what constitutes anti-Semitic behavior or speech. And recently, just about a week and a half ago, a group of British academics who are also Israelis put forward a petition actually against the use of this definition in the context of British universities, UK universities, I should say. And David then has drafted, it's a work in progress, very recently, a paper which is critiquing this call to reject. So he shared both the book and that piece with me. And so those are the things I've been working with in preparing my response to him. And I believe those materials have been made available in some form to workshop participants, but David and Lenka can comment on that. So, okay, but also want to respond to what you just said, David. So first of all, I want to preface my remarks by saying that nothing that I proceed to say, is in any way meant to detract from the outrageous and unacceptable aspects of what you just spoke about. So there's no question that there's problematic statements, problematic behavior, that many people, many Jews have found themselves in very uncomfortable positions and have not been able to, have had trouble seeking proper redress for those situations. But nonetheless, we still have to raise, there are lots of questions that we need to raise about these issues. So to your point about empiricism, that we need to start from anti-Semitism and then back away and try, first we need to start with the anti-Semitic activities and then try to back away and analyze them and explain them and so forth. I can entirely understand the desire to do so, because obviously if you don't start with the empirical anti-Semitism, you risk not seeing it or explaining it away in some way. I'm totally alive to that concern. On the other hand, we do have to in some way face the fact that we have incidents that take place, and the most egregious ones, it's maybe easier, it's easy not to fall into this situation, but we do have contexts, we do have situations in which there is one party that's convinced that something anti-Semitic has happened, and there are others who disagree and do not find it anti-Semitic. And we do need some way of, we need some methodology, we need some way of adjudicating that. It's obviously a lot of what your work is trying to do, of course. But for me, I guess, as a humanist, as a historian, not as an empirical social scientist, I get a little bit suspicious, or I have a little bit of caution about starting from the empirical depiction of what is anti-Semitic, because I'm aware of the fact that there is so much disagreement about what actually that constitutes, even among people who you might expect wouldn't disagree about it, so to speak, Jews. And I think I've certainly encountered situations where I've noticed among Jews disagreement as to whether a particular incident or situation qualifies as anti-Semitism. And the very fact that we have in this recent petition signed by all these British Israeli academics, I mean, this issue comes up there as well. I also want to raise a question. You started out by saying that there is a distinctive left-wing anti-Semitism. And what I would want you just to clarify for us, what is this, do you mean by this that we have a long-standing history going back deep into the 19th century, back to the emergence of socialism, communist, classic left-wing, modern left-wing ideologies, that we can trace continually the presence of anti-Semitism in the left-wing world? Or are there actual distinctive features from an ideological perspective in terms of worldview that characterize left-wing anti-Semitism that is distinct from right-wing or other kinds of anti-Semitism? I don't know that you've been on earlier, but we heard earlier this morning, we've heard some attempts at emphasizing aspects of Jews and money, conspiratorial theories, blood. Are there, to what degree does this distinctive left-wing anti-Semitism, does it share these concepts, these approaches? If so, how distinct is it really from an ideological perspective? Or are we really mainly talking about a historical trajectory, a tradition of anti-Semitism that's deeply rooted in the left? It seems to me pretty critical that we clarify, that we come to some kind of clarity on that point, because that, I think, can help us when we encounter cases or alleged cases of anti-Semitism on the left. It can help us clarify whether what we're dealing with is, okay, a case of the left-wing worldview that is also an anti-Semitic worldview, or that's closely related to an anti-Semitic worldview, or here's a left-wing person who, by virtue of their, having grown up in the UK or in Poland or in Russia or wherever, where there is anti-Semitism in the general culture, they also call upon some of those anti-Semitic tendencies and stereotypes when they're addressing a particular situation. That seems to me a critical point that requires unpacking and clarification. Okay, now I want to go on to some of the things that I prepared to say. And I'm going to ask Siroky David, to just signal when he feels it's time to move on. And I'm more than happy to stop at a particular point and have the discussion proceed and resume, or perhaps not. One can go on forever, of course. So, all right. So I want to quickly just mention about those aspects of David Hirsh's work that were most thought-provoking and helpful for me. So first and foremost is his coinage of the so-called Livingston Formulation. And this refers to the former two-time London mayor and well-known British socialist politician, Ken Livingstone. And it refers to really a sort of trope of discourse when someone on the left wing, though it can apply elsewhere, but David Hirsh is particularly emphasizes its prominence on left-wing politics. When a left-wing person is critiqued for having done something anti-Semitic, he immediately, or she immediately responds and says, no, this accusation is really just a product of the desire of Israel supporters, of the Israel lobby, to shut down what I'm saying. They don't want to hear critique, so they accuse me of anti-Semitism. And what I find especially helpful about this is it enables us to see a whole host of what we might otherwise consider to be sort of independent statements or reactions as really part of a larger discourse, almost a kind of ritualized response to accusations of anti-Semitism. And as such, pushes us to look past the immediate individuals or the immediate circumstances, and to really think about structure of thought and behavior that undergird the LF, as I'm going to refer to it for short. So that I think is a very, very helpful concept. And the other is his notion of what he calls the politics of position, which is his account, description of how left-wing politics have evolved in recent generations, away from the more classic left-wing concern for the oppressed peoples of all nations, in particular the oppressed, working class and so forth, to rise up and achieve their liberation and to improve their lot, towards a more national-based, or we might say sort of regional-based approach to thinking about the oppressor and the oppressed. That is to say, the West, by virtue of its colonial imperial past, is the oppressor, and it's all the peoples who were victimized by that Western oppression and colonialism who are the oppressed peoples. And so there's a sort of tendency, the politics of position is basically, you as a left-wing politician, you want to basically, you need to side with those oppressed peoples. And so you don't really interest yourself exactly what's the state of human rights or democratic politics or whatever in those particular contexts. If you want to be, as you refer, David, as if you want to be seen as a member of the community of the good, sort of on the right side of history, you have to support those peoples. And this leads to a situation where Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, any number of these groups basically become progressive forces for positive change by virtue of the fact that they are responding to the oppression and the domination of the West. And this is also a helpful point, and I saw that maybe David wants to talk in a moment again, so I'll stop with this. I'll just sort of summarize this and then stop. This is an extremely helpful concept, it seems to be, this politics of position, and it raises a certain challenge, or creates a certain tension with your overall interest in talking about anti-Semitism on the left, because it raises the possibility that at least a lot of what we might see as anti-Semitism is instead, or at least to a large extent, really motivated by this politics of position. I'll try to stop soon, but I want to just sort of clarify my point. From the perspective of this politics of position, how is it not inevitable that Israel would be, by virtue of its European origins and still close connection with the Western world and Western politics, and yet engaged in an ongoing conflict with non-European people or peoples? Is it not inevitable that Israel would be seen as a kind of villain, as a kind of enemy, as a kind of incarnation of all that's evil in the contemporary situation? Does one need anti-Semitism for that? Do not the politics of position already do a lot of the work? And this is where the point that I made before as to whether is there a distinctive left-wing anti-Semitism, or is it more that left-wingers partake of the anti-Semitic menu that's out there, is really relevant. Because if the politics of position is already doing a lot of the work, so to speak, then one can say, okay, so these left-wing voices sort of very quickly, naturally, inevitably, in a sense, come to a very anti-Israel position. And then in the course of articulating that, they feed upon, they draw upon, they exploit some of these anti-Semitic stereotypes that are present in the general culture. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I have plenty more to say. I don't need to say it, but yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much, Daniel. And I'll just, before you respond, David, add a question that was posted in the Q&A and I think speaks to your background. You may have something to say on effective methods for non-Jewish leftists to combat anti-Semitism in our circles. Conversation is obviously critical, but there are any methods you would recommend for ideologically or factually countering that form of anti-Semitism.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I was very late getting you the material, and I'm just actually amazed by how quickly you've read and understood and internalized a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last 15 years. So thank you so much for that. I want to answer a couple of those points. I don't think I'll take too long, so hopefully we'll have time for maybe another round or for questions from other people. To start with the question, and this is of course one of the standard responses from people who supported Corbyn and his politics, was there is no Corbynite anti-Semitism. Corbyn is not an anti-Semite. Yes, there is anti-Semitism, but it comes from outside of the left, outside from our tribe. It comes from over there, from the society in general. And exactly as you suggested, it's not a left anti-Semitism, but it's anti-Semitic individuals come into the left and haven't yet got rid of their anti-Semitism. Now, I think that's highly problematic. Firstly, people like Ken Livingston and Jeremy Corbyn are people who have been brought up on the left and who have been in the left for their whole lives. These are kind of old guys, right? They're really the 68 generation. They have been doing this for years. They are not people who are sort of anti-Semitic people who bring with them some kind of visceral racism against the Jews in their golf club or the Jews at their school. These are people who are precisely as you suggested, involved in a politics. And it's a politics which is authentically part of an anti-Semitic tradition. Interesting question actually about what is specifically left or right. And it seems to me that one of the things about the left anti-Semitism that we see is that it's specifically political anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism which has a worldview. It's anti-Semitism which builds, I mean, in this case, as you described, one of the ways in which it happens is that the worldview says, keep your eye on the ball, right? Keep your eye on what's really important. What's really important is that we live in a world where the real aggressor, the real force for oppression is capitalism or modernity or imperialism or whatever you want to call it. It's a machine, it's global, it's run from Europe and America, it has a grip on everybody. It's the real cause of war and famine and ill health and misery across the world, right? And so keep your eye on that ball. And if some of the people who are against imperialism reach for, anti-Semitic politics or terroristic politics or things that we might not like, then keep your eye on the ball. The real aggressors are imperialism, and people who oppose imperialism, as Judith Butler said, are fundamentally on the global left. And in so much as they are have internalized politics of hatred and racism and anti-Semitism, they've got that through imperialism. They've been driven crazy by imperialism. And in so much as they are against imperialism, then they're on our side. So this is not at all a matter of, you know, Jeremy Corbyn being a kind of secret little anti-Semite who expresses his anti-Semitism politically. It's the other way around. I was really interested in the term you use, which is motivation, right? And you said that we don't need to explain. So just to complete the previous thought first, you have a bipolar world. You have a world in which everything bad is fundamentally explicable by reference to capitalism, modernity, imperialism, and then everything else is fundamentally on our side. There's still another kind of leap, right? And the other leap is how that gets connected to Israel in particular. I mean, I don't think your explanation for that was strong enough. How is it that Israel becomes symbolic of all of this evil? How is it that capitalism, imperialism, modernity becomes also Zionism? That Zionism becomes symbolic of everything bad in the world, becomes the leader of everything bad in the world, sometimes becomes the thing that drives the great United States of America to war in its interests, or sometimes is just the plaything of America. How does Zionism get its central position in this worldview? And there are a number of answers to that. One is that it was put there quite on purpose by the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union and the KGB decided to put it there, right? Decided to say that this is how it's going to be. We're going to say that Israel is the apartheid state, the imperialist state in the Middle East, and Israel is a specific evil on the planet. That Soviet anti-Semitism has actually been adopted by very many people who don't know their own heritage, who don't understand to what extent what they think comes actually from a KGB conspiracy, right? We talk about conspiracy fantasy, but there was a KGB conspiracy to create a left which focused on Israel as a unique evil on the planet. So that's kind of beside the point, but what I wanted to get back to was motivation, right? If we have a worldview which says that everything bad in the world is representable in terms of Zionism. You know, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, there was a successful campaign to portray Zionism as being the key racism on the planet now that apartheid had been defeated, as if all other racisms were neither here nor there. It was Zionism. Now, you don't have to say that this is motivated by anti-Semitism. I don't think the examples that I gave are motivated by an underlying conscious or unconscious hatred of Jews. I think the examples I gave come from a practice of understanding Zionism to be the key symbol of global imperialism. I mean, it's extraordinary for Jeremy Corbyn, because Jeremy Corbyn was very popular at one point, but he couldn't get over his record of understanding Zionism and the Jews who are said to support it as being a unique evil. He couldn't get over it. He couldn't deal with it. And the reason he couldn't deal with it is because it was deep down in his politics. Corbyn himself comes from a Morning Star Communist Party political tradition, but it could as easily have been a Trotskyist position actually by now. To come to the point specifically, I don't think the people who embrace anti-Semitic politics are necessarily or even usually motivated by a hatred of Jews. I don't think they are, and I don't think they do. But I think when you stand up at WIT's campus in South Africa and you say the Zionists are going to be driven out of South Africa, you might not be motivated by hatred of Jews, but what you do is clearly anti-Semitic politics. And of course, we're used to that, right? We know that racism isn't only hatred. Racism is a structure of power throughout society. Racism is about institutions, it's about discourse, it's about ways of thinking. it's not only about hatred of black people or hatred of Muslims or hatred of Jews. So that would be strange if, in order to say something was anti-Semitic and therefore threatening, we had to say it was motivated consciously by some underlying hatred. I don't think that. I want to just say something, yeah, about the left and the right. I wish I'd had time to be at more of this conference, because I suspect there's quite a lot of discussion about the left anti-Semitism and the right anti-Semitism, and which is the kind of real threat. And I find that this is always problematic. By the way, in terms of the politics of position, my interest in left anti-Semitism was not originally because I was Jewish, and it was not originally because I was against the left. It was the opposite. It's because I was part of the left. And if you look at Marx's interaction with Bakunin, with Dühring, with Bruno Bauer, with the anti-Semites in his movement, you'll see that the people he went for by name were the anti-Semites. And the reason he did that is because he recognized a specific threat to the left from anti-Semitism. And we've seen that in England. You know, there was a kind of movement for a left-wing government, and it was trashed. And it was trashed because it was led by people who couldn't recognize anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic politics. So the idea that we should be centrally against the anti-Semitism in the political tribe that we hate anyway is completely kind of foreign to me. I'm in the first place against the anti-Semitism that I see around me and in my own movement, in my own political family. And I think anyone who is more bothered by the anti-Semitism that's over there than by the anti-Semitism that's around them and in their own tradition, I think is a problem. I think anyone who says the real anti-Semitism is over there, and we see this a lot on both the left and the right, is always a problem, and partly because the two political anti-Semitisms of what I would call contemporary populism, and contemporary populism, in my view, I like Hannah Arendt, is a kind of prototype of a contemporary totalitarianism, a contemporary totalitarian movement. And it's not accidental that both of the 20th century totalitarian movements had a real thing about Jews, right? They were obsessed by Jews. And quite often it's inverted. And it's said of people who oppose anti-Semitism, why are you so obsessed by Jews? Why don't you care about Islamophobia? Why don't you care about anti-Black racism? And the answer, of course, is because it is anti-Semitism that obsesses about Jews. And it's so interesting how many times, how often, when you raise the issue of anti-Semitism or when you defend something like the IRA definition, the response you come up against is, why are you so focused on Jews? Why do Jews need a special defense against anti-Semitism? And it feels like a very all lives matter response to a Jewish lives matter question. And it's a kind of universalist response. Why are you so particular about anti-Semitism and about Jews? Well, I'm not. I see anti-Semitism within my own movement. I don't see Islamophobia within my own movement, and I don't see anti-Black racism on the left very much. It exists for sure, but I don't see it as a political movement, as a set of political ideas. I don't see it as part of the kind of central narrative of what people are educating each other to believe. I'm going to stop there for a minute because I hope that we can have some more, that we have time.
Very, very good. Thank you. And so, of course, all this talk about the left and the right, Eugene Finkel has to ask the optimist question, what about the center? Isn't there anti-Semitism there too? So feel free to take that up as your next project if you want to move a little bit to the right, but not too far. And I also wanted to give Daniel Steinkoken an opportunity to fill in some of the thoughts that he was cut short from doing. and to give you two questions from the audience. One, has intersectionality been used by the left to target Israel and Jewish national aspirations? Question from Joel Brescian. And from Ariel Rosenberg, do you think the obsession with Jews has to do with the fact that Jews exist in the traditional past of Christianity, representing a type of way of life that the left wants to distance itself in favor of internationalism or religion? The radical center, yes. So first, Daniel and David, you can chime back in.
Daniel, you're muted, I think.
I'm a little unsure if I'm supposed to address those questions or the things that I had thought to say before, or to try to do both, or if the questions are for David. Sorry.
Either way, just a couple minutes to what you feel would help this discussion advance most fruitfully.
Yeah, I guess one issue, since it's sort of very hot at the moment for you, David, has to do with the call to reject and your critique of the call to reject. And I wondered if, and it seems that one of the key issues that comes up here is the question of what exactly the status of the IHRA recommendations are. That is to say, are they guidelines, or are they actually sort of a kind of coercive element that universities are now deploying to restrict speech and so forth? And I just thought it would be valuable for you maybe to say something about that, since it's an issue that you're very much involved in at the moment. And here I was just struck by, I read what the signatories to the call to reject, they refer to an article by legal expert Rebecca Gold, which basically, she makes the point that even if these recommendations were in the general rubric and not intended to, as it were, cut down or certain kinds of, to restrict speech or to police speech, let's say, on a campus environment, she makes the argument, actually, if I could just share my screen very quickly here. There, she makes the argument that the kinds of abuses that tend to take place here, you'll see here, are intrinsic to all speech codes and speech bans, regardless of the groups they purport to defend. I'm just curious what your thoughts on this are. I find myself in a difficult situation in addressing this, because I looked at some of the other materials that the signatories refer to as problems, and they didn't strike me as particularly problematic necessarily. But then I encounter something like this, and this legal scholar who makes the argument that these kinds of attempts to, that basically making the argument that intended simply as a general rubric to not actually restrict speech specifically, in effect is then used by universities to do that. How much of a price are we willing, or should we be willing to pay in that regard? And I guess the other question I wanted to raise in regard to this, what are the potential risks? That is to say, in light of your formula, the notion of the Livingston Formulation, insofar as universities or other bodies are actually successful in restricting or modifying or in some way removing anti-Semitic behavior from these various contexts, is there not the risk that it will actually reinforce the underlying attitudes that give rise to something like the Livingston Formulation? That is to say, the more that one actually succeeds in responding and addressing this issue, it reinforces this notion that a lot of people seem to have, that all this is basically an attempt to cut down, to restrict criticism of Israel and so forth. So in being successful in countering anti-Semitism, do we not actually in a way reinforce it? One concern. Okay, I'll stop there. I apologize I didn't answer the questions. I feel like David maybe is in a better position to answer those questions.
Thank you so much. So let me begin by telling you what the situation is on campus at the moment. And let me tell you how I understand my position on campus. Back in 2004, when the boycott movement, the movement to boycott Israel, but nowhere else on the planet from our campus, became powerful in my trade union, and the fight about the exclusion of Israelis from our campus began to hot up, I felt myself, and I couldn't give you any much concrete evidence, partly because I live in England, where the raising of an eyebrow is as frightening as it gets, right? But my feeling was that I became very much designated as the Zionist, right? I became designated as the Zionist, and therefore the racist and the defender of apartheid, and the spokesperson for Israel, right? So in terms of chilling speech, my feeling is that that is what happened to me and to other people like me. And by the way, I think it's very important that you know, it's a basic ABC, right? Racism constructs race, right? You can identify yourself however you like, and you can have all kinds of very nice and empowering self-identification. But if you get identified when you're walking down the street late at night as Black or as Muslim or as a woman, you can be in big trouble, right? So racism designates race. And I felt what happened to me was that anti-Zionism designated me as a Zionist. And what it meant by Zionism was a racist, a pro-imperialist, and a liar, because that's the important part of the Livingston formulation. It doesn't accuse you of just getting it wrong and being a bit overzealous and having a chip on your shoulder and having been formed by the family memory of the Holocaust. Doesn't accuse you of that. It accuses you of being part of a conspiracy to pretend that you experience anti-Semitism, when really what you're trying to do is to silence criticism of Israel. It's very important that the Livingston formulation is always an allegation of bad faith. Now, of course, anti-Semitism is, in one sense, fundamentally itself bad faith, right? Anti-Semitism is bad faith. Racism is bad faith. It's based on lies. At the same time, we know that anti-Semitism and racism and sexism can be carried and can be defended and pushed by people who don't have any self-identification of themselves as racist, as sexist, as Islamophobic, whatever. So there's that strange mixture of anti-Semitism being certainly bad faith, but also being a kind of hidden structure that we're not aware that we are a part of. And that's ABC, right? Nobody can become anti-racist just by the effort of the will, right? You have to work on it. You have to do various things and work very hard to change yourself. This is kind of ABC, and it's true of anti-Semitism too. But every time you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, it's not listened to, it's not taken seriously, and people are taught to recognize someone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism as someone on the right. In other words, as someone who doesn't really belong, is not really at home in the labor movement, in the trade union, in the sociology department, right? You're a Trumpist. If you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, you support Trump. Let me tell you something. Not a single person in the British Labour Party is a Trumpist, right? So why were Jews treated as though they were Trumpists? They were treated like that because the fact that they raised the issue of anti-Semitism was understood as an attack on the left, as an attack on the community. And that's how they were expelled from the community of the good. Sorry, I'm going a long way around here to talk about coercion. But it is anti-Semitism that is coercive, not opposing anti-Semitism. So let's ask the question about the IRA definition. The IRA definition is in fact incredibly tame, right? The IRA definition begins by restating that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. The IRA definition gives you a number, I think it's 11 examples of the kinds of things that may, in some contexts, be anti-Semitic. So if you wanted to use IRA as a kind of legislative tool to stop people saying certain things, you couldn't do it. In fact, IRA would protect you. If there was someone running around trying to say all criticism, sorry, if there was someone running around trying to say, what is, sorry, I've got confused now, that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. If there was someone trying to say all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, then IRA would defend you. What IRA does is it takes 11 things which we know from our experience and from an empirical study of what anti-Semitism looks like in the real world, gives you 11 things which are quite often anti-Semitic. And IRA says, if you see this, look again and check out the context and the meaning, check out what was meant, check out what was heard, check out what effect it might have had on people listening, and make a judgment. That's what IRA does. Somebody gave me an example. They said, how would you like it if affirmative action, if opposition to affirmative action was defined as being racist and you had no space to oppose affirmative action? That is not what IRA does. What IRA does is to say, if you see somebody strongly opposing affirmative action, you should check out what they're saying and make a judgment about whether they're doing that in a racist way. And that's dead on. If you see somebody denouncing Kamala Harris, right, you should make a judgment as to whether they're doing that in a sexist way. Are they talking about what she wears or what she looks like, or, you know, Hillary Clinton, whatever? And we're very comfortable and used to these alarm bells ringing. But with anti-Semitism, they often don't ring. So some of the examples I gave at the beginning, Bongani Masuku, for example, who said Jews should leave South Africa if they are Zionist. My colleagues in Britain and my union defended him, hosted him, learnt from him. So what IRA does is to say, if you see this kind of discourse, it should ring an alarm bell. And then you should make a judgment according to context, remembering that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So how it comes that people are so afraid of IRA is a question that needs answering, right? Because there's nothing in the text that is so frightening. Why are people afraid of IRA? And I think they're afraid of IRA because they think that IRA represents some kind of cunning Jewish power, right? And the evidence of the cunning is the caveats, right? The caveats say criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, and you need to make a judgment in relation to context. And that just shows how clever they are, because they don't mean that bit. So I think there is nothing in IRA that could possibly legitimately be used to police speech, other than, you know, if you want to say that any kind of Jewish self-determination, for example, any kind of state of Israel, it would be necessarily racist. If you want to say that, then people are going to have a look and find out if what you're saying is anti-Semitic. Or if you want to say Israel is like Nazis, there's going to be an alarm bell and people are going to say, all right, let's have a look. Let's make a judgment. So I can promise an alarm bell, but I certainly can't promise legislation. I mean, in Britain, we have the Macpherson principle, which says that anyone who says they've experienced racism should be taken seriously. We have the Equality Act 2010, which outlines in great detail what harassment means. We have the EHRC report, which people should read if they're interested in Labour anti-Semitism, because the EHRC is the government mandated body which protects and carries out the Equality Act. And the EHRC said that one of the central ways in which Jews suffered anti-Semitism in Corbyn's Labour Party was this constant, unthinking relentless allegation of bad faith. Jews would say, I've heard this, I've heard that, I've experienced this. And people would say, we know what you're up to, right? The Jews are always up to something. So EHRC said that was actually one of the key modes of anti-Semitism itself. Let me just go. I want to say something about intersectionality. I mean, people should read Karen Sturgner about intersectionality and anti-Semitism. She's, I think, one of the leading voices. Intersectionality itself was very important, I think, because intersectionality said that, you know, the oppression of women is not the same as the oppression of Black people, and that the oppression of Black women is not simply Black people plus women, but it's something new. It's something different. And you can't just add up 1 + 1 = 2, but you have to look at the quality of what actually happens. Again, the method of beginning with the anti-Black misogynist structures, and you have to begin there and think about what it has. Sorry, I'm hearing my own voice back in me now. And what intersectionality has sometimes become is the opposite of that. The intersectionality has become a quite sort of trivial way of adding up oppressions to give a points total and excluding some oppressions as being not valid. People will all have known about the exclusion of women from the Dyke March in Chicago, where they had a rainbow flag with a Magen David on it, which they said represented their own identity, and they were excluded. Why? They were excluded for being Zionist, racist, pro-apartheid, imperialist. They were excluded from the community of the good because they had a Star of David, and it was said, therefore, that they were fundamentally Trumpists or racists, pro-apartheid, and the rest of it. This is how Jews get excluded from our demonstrations, our movement, our campuses. Let me give you one more example. Sorry, I should talk more about intersectionality, but I don't have time. One more example. There was an example from San Francisco State University that I was involved with. And what happened was very, very simple, right? With the election of Donald Trump, the student societies got together, the Lesbian and Gay Society, the Muslim Society, the anti-racist societies, the left, they got together and they said, we're going to have a fair. We're going to have a coming together where students can know their rights. We're going to have a Know Your Rights fair, including all the people who may have reason to be frightened in 2016 about the victory of Donald Trump. And Hillel, the Jewish communal organization, said, we'd like to come too, because we're worried about the possibility of a government which is related to white supremacists being in the White House. And they were told, sorry, there's no room. And they said, come on, don't be silly, of course there's room. And they were told, you're not part of the anti-Trump alliance. You're part of the Trump alliance. That is how this kind of anti-Semitism works. And whether it's motivated by a conscious or an unconscious hatred of Jews as Jews is actually neither here nor there. Because the Jews on campus in San Francisco were excluded from the community of people who wanted to defend themselves against the possible ramifications of a Donald Trump victory. And that's how it works. Quickly, about the center. I don't know. I mean, look, obviously there is a history of liberal anti-Semitism. It seems to me that at the moment in Britain and in America and in many other places, I think the smart way to think about what's happening is the rise of populism. And I think left populism has quite a lot in common with right populism. I think, interestingly, if you go through the things that Brexiters say and the things that Trump says and the things that Corbyn says, you find a lot in common. And not least is this notion of the enemy of the people. we are the 99%, and we're rising up against the elite in the cities, the educated, the bankers, the globalists who are here to do your country down and sell your jobs to China. So it seems to me that the key thing at the moment is the fragility of the democratic state and democratic politics. So that would be what I would say about the center. And just very quickly about non-Jewish people on the left. There are many, many very smart, very brave non-Jewish people who fight anti-Semitism. There are also quite a lot of Jewish people who embrace the politics of anti-Semitism, right? That's just true. Anyone who's been in this for 5 minutes knows that, you know, Jews don't all agree, and that there are Jews who embrace and defend. Bongani Masuku, for example, who I quoted earlier on, was defended in the court in South Africa by a Jewish anti-Zionist. So I could say a lot more about Jewish anti-Zionism, but I don't have time. What I would say is really keep away from the identity politics. Anti-Semitism is external to us, it is objective, and it's a threatening social phenomenon, and we oppose it. And it can't only be done by Jews, it must be done by everyone else. And very quickly, yes, it often feels when you oppose anti-Semitism that all you're doing is winding everybody up and bringing more anti-Semitism down on your head, right? That all, you know, if you say, this is what's going on, this is what a boycott of Israel means, this is the discourse it brings into the union, this is what happens, this is how it happens. And no, I'm not defending Israel because I think we're part of the chosen people and a racist elite. And any movement which opposes anti-Semitism does feel like it's bringing anti-Semitism down upon our heads. But let's be really clear, racism is not caused by opposing racism. Again, it's ABC. Thank you very much.
David. Thank you, David.